Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful B-Sides. My name's Kieron Craggs. I'm a digital forensic and e-discovery specialist. I currently work for one of the big four professional services organisations here in the UK. My day job, essentially, is project managing teams that work on large corporate investigations involving electronic data and digital forensics. Before I go into a bit more detail, just a bit of additional background about me. So I'm a graduate of Leeds Beckett, so hopefully there's some wonderful Leeds Beckett folks in the room. Be looking to you for some support. My career before my current position, very much a mixture of digital forensic positions and cyber investigation positions across different organisations, dealing with government, law enforcement work, and of course corporate investigations as well. As you will shortly tell, there is one slide in this presentation which is very kindly been donated by James, because believe it or not, I didn't turn up to B-Sides this morning with a laptop and the idea that I was going to do a presentation. So I have everything on one page. So if there's anything that I don't explain well, hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end, or you can come and speak to me after. Okay? So I'm going to start with a question for the audience. Hopefully there is a willing volunteer, so just put your hands up. If you had to support a corporate investigation involving electronic data in your current job, do you think you would be able to do that successfully? Brave. Well, hopefully, I say hopefully, maybe not hopefully for you, but hopefully by the end of this presentation, I might be able to change your mind slightly. We'll see. But anybody else that is very confident in their organisation's security and compliance posture, please do let me know afterwards if I've given you anything to think about. And I'll be asking the same question at the end as well. So if anybody additional wants to answer, that would be fab. I'm very eager to hear whether you've learned anything by the end. So before I go into the main portion of this, one more thing that I will throw in is, why should you actually care about this, right? Corporate investigations doesn't sound particularly sexy, does it? What's the motivation? What's the benefit behind it? Well, I'll give you this example. Say you are a reasonably sized business. One day you have a knock on the door from a regulator, and that regulator has legal powers to come into your premises and take data relating to something that they suspect may have happened. If that was to happen to you, what would be your plan? And if you weren't able to deal with that in a good way, what do you think the repercussions might be? So let's think about things like financial penalties, for example. You think about breaches in GDPR, massive potential monetary penalties there, and also reputation as well. Reputational damage to organisations is a really massive issue. So the way that, certainly in my experience, we tend to deal with one of these investigations is using e-discovery. So not many of you in the room might have heard of e-discovery or fully know what it is. But essentially, e-discovery is the process of identifying, collecting, and producing electronic information in response to a legal matter or investigation. Very helpfully, particularly for my presentation, there is a model that underpins e-discovery called the e-discovery reference model, or EDRM. That has several stages in it which essentially guide you on how you would go from identifying data that might be relevant to producing it to somebody else on the other side. So I would go through the key bits of the model just to give you all a bit more of a understanding, perhaps give you some things to consider in your own organisations. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a 3-point framework on how you could potentially be better prepared for one of these types of situation. So the first step in the EDRM then is identification. So before we even do anything technical, we need to identify the data. So that can range from identifying physical bits of equipment to systems as well. So a very complex IT environment, or even simple IT environment, made up of multiple systems, doesn't have to be hardware, it can be applications. So if you think, for example, you might have some file servers over here, you might have a financial application over here. All of those are potentially really very relevant sources of data for somebody doing an investigation. In terms of identifying those, think about your environment as a whole. So if I was to ask you, what are your key production systems? Could you tell me? Do you have it written down? Do you have a network map? Do you have a systems list? If you don't, you're going to have a bit of a problem. And also, it's about the personnel as well. So who are the personnel in that organisation that hold all of that knowledge? Do we readily have access to them? Do we know who they are? The next step is preservation. So once we've got an idea of what the systems are, how do we actually protect that data? So we might have identified some systems which we think are relevant to the matter, say a fraud investigation, for example. But how do we span the gap between identifying those and actually taking receipt of that data? There needs to be a middle step, and that middle step is preservation. So it's how do we protect the data? So there's a few different ways that you can do that. Commonly you'll hear phrases like legal hold or litigation hold. So that's essentially a technical control in a system, say like an email system, for example, which stops retention policies and things like that being applied. So that data will stay in state in the system until you lift that hold. So that gives you the opportunity then to decide whether that data is going to be relevant to your matter or not. The next step is collection. So we've identified the data, we've protected it. We now need to think about how we're actually going to extract that data from the systems that we're looking at. So if we take email as hopefully an easy to understand example, let's say you run your email environment in Office 365 or Microsoft 365, for example. Microsoft 365 has a very handy e-discovery feature where you can collect data and then export it in a very handy format. But it's not as easy as you think it is. So if you think about that as a whole within your environment, actually, that's a feature that requires additional licensing. So does your organisation have those licenses? Do you have agreements in place to get them if you need them? Do you have roles set up in the environment so that appropriate personnel can use those features? And also, are people even trained in how to use them? And then also as well, I'll briefly mention digital forensics, which sometimes is a bit of a dirty word in e-discovery. So generally e-discovery is kind of a best endeavours type exercise where, we're doing a reasonable amount of work to try and get the data that we're looking for. In theory, you'd like to do that in a full digital forensics manner, full audit trail, belt, braces, tick tie, etc. But you don't necessarily need to do that. But the one thing that I will give you as a takeaway on that point is, regardless, record keeping is very important. Particularly, think about, you might be dealing with something inside an organisation, like a HR matter, things like that. keeping documentation around the process that you followed, how you got the data, how you went about identifying it is really important when people come to ask questions about how you did something later. The next two I will cover sort of briefly because I want to get onto the 3-point framework. So the next step I've kind of muddled together, which is processing, review and analysis. So that is all about, once you've got that data, how do you get it into a structured format that other people can then look at? So commonly in e-discovery, you'll do that using tools such as Nuix and Relativity and things like that. They'll essentially grab all of your data and put it into a structured format where it can be put in a review environment. So one of the common products on the market is Relativity. These are the ones like Reveal and Accelerate and things like that. Essentially, they are quite feature-rich document review environments. So that lets some other specialist look at the contents of the documents, of the data, to make a decision about whether the material is relevant to the matter or not. And then the last point in the EDRM is production and presentation. So thinking, to the end of that process, how do we report our findings? So there's lots of things that go into that. You might have proprietary types of data in your own organisation that don't necessarily translate very well into just a document format. So really have a think about how you would report that data to somebody else. So onto the 3-point framework then. So very simply, the first point is knowing your data. So like I said at the beginning, who are the key contacts? What are the key production systems? And having that readily available to compliance teams, legal teams, whoever may need that information. The second point is about retention and backups. So retention doesn't mean backup necessarily. You should really treat them separately. But retention, we're talking about what technical and administrative controls do we apply to different types of data to make sure that we're keeping it in compliance with organisational policy and legislation. So, for example, if you're a financial services business, Financial Conduct Authority says that you have to keep certain types of data between 3 and 10 years. So do you have a plan in place for that? Have you tested it? Are the controls there? Do they work? And then the final point that I'll leave you on is having a plan. Having a plan is massive. You'd have a plan for any other business continuity problem, a cyber incident, whatever it may be. But you should have a problem for you should have a plan for an investigation as well. So think about, an event where you might have a dawn raid or something like that, which essentially, like I said at the beginning, a regulator or law enforcement could come in, use their legal powers and take your data. What's your plan? What would you do? Who would you contact? Where's the data? What are the key technical, administrative problems that you're going to have if that event happens? And then also as well, thinking about having that plan visible in the business. Very much like all the other types of plan you have to deal with an incident or problem in the business. It needs to be front of mind of the people that are going to be involved in the technical delivery and administration of that. So, going back to my point at the beginning, if you had to support a corporate investigation, would you be prepared? Perhaps not looking at James this time, but somebody else. Has your answer perhaps changed from what you were thinking initially? Yeah? So, do you want to give me an example of a point that you've picked up?
Yeah, I think definitely kind of around having a plan for that type of investigation. So I think, we've got lots for cyber investigations, we've got lots for internal investigations, for HR investigations, but not necessarily one that will specifically sit around that compliance.
Fantastic. Was there somebody else?
Yeah. So again, planning, but also the fact that there's a lot of tools in products that we already use, like Office 365, that can make this easier. Get familiar with those now, rather than when somebody turns up at your door and is demanding this information.
Yeah, and that is an excellent point. I worked with tons of organisations where they don't have plans around this, and you start asking them about their environment, and actually, say, taking the Office 365 example, like you say, the tools are already there. They just don't know about it. And having, I think having good knowledge about the products that you've got in your environment is really important, because you'll lean on them when you have a problem like this. That is the end of my time. So thank you very much for listening. My LinkedIn is on the slide, so feel free to follow and give me a message. If anybody wants to come and have a chat after, please let me know. Thank you very much.